When you hear the words Underground Railroad, what do you think of? Maybe you are picturing a deep hole under the ground with metal railroad tracks running for miles. Or maybe you are thinking about a subway system like the ones in big cities that have electric trains underground. But does whatever you are picturing have to do with slavery in the South? If it does, you might be on the right track when trying to understand the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was not a railroad at all. In fact, it was not even underground. So, what was the Underground Railroad, and how did it help many people escape slavery? In order to understand the significance of the Underground Railroad, it is important to first understand slavery and what it was. Slavery is a practice in which one person, known as a master, is allowed to own another human being. From 1619 to 1865, Africans were enslaved in colonial America and the United States. As property, slaves in the United States had no rights. There was not an age limit to slavery. If you were born a slave, you were a slave for life and would be forced to work long hours. It began in 1619 when what we know as the United States was still under British rule. During that time, Virginia was an isolated British settlement on the Chesapeake Bay. The colonists or people in Virginia were trying to create a good place to live, but they struggled to do so because of disease, hunger, and attacks by Native Americans. It was in that year, 1619, that a ship came to Virginia carrying 20 kidnapped Africans. The colonists in Virginia decided to create indentured servants out of Africans. This meant that they were under contract to work for a certain amount of time in exchange for land and freedom. The kidnapped Africans joined poor white Europeans as servants to the Virginian people. This started the beginnings of slavery in America. Families were separated and torn apart when they were auctioned off and sold to their owners. Africans became chattel to their masters, which means personal property that can be owned for life. Instead of being thought of as people with values and rights, slaves were treated like property. Many slaves slept in wooden shacks with dirt floors and little to no furniture. If they did have a bed, it was usually just a blanket or some hay. Certain slaves had the luxury of staying in the master's home, but not many received this privilege. The life of a slave was often very difficult and demanding. In many instances, slaves were forced to work from before the sun was up until it went down in the evening. The slave masters worked their slaves in many different jobs. Many slaves worked long, hard hours in the fields each day, picking cotton, harvesting sugarcane, and planting and harvesting rice and tobacco. Other jobs included building railroads, working in the dairy, weaving, carpentry, washing clothes, and cooking. Slaves who disobeyed their masters were severely punished and beaten. By the year 1821, there were about 1.5 million slaves in the United States, and by 1861, the slave population had risen to more than 4 million. Think about life as a slave. How do you think the Africans felt doing what they did each day? Knowing that you would die a slave, would you continue to work or try to find some way to find freedom? Many slaves wanted to escape the hard conditions of life they were forced to endure each day. They knew they could find freedom in the North, in places like Pennsylvania and Canada. But how could they possibly escape their masters? If they were caught, they would be beaten and maybe even killed. For some slaves, this was a risk they were willing to take. Because traveling on foot from the south to the north made for a long and dangerous journey, people who were against slavery, called abolitionists, would allow runaway slaves to stay in their homes overnight. They would also feed and give aid to the slaves. But how would the slaves know the house was a safe place? There is a belief that the people who helped protect the slaves would hang a quilt outside their home as a sign of being a safe place. The quilt would have a specific pattern sewed into it that would let slaves know there was a safe house. We do not know for sure, however, whether or not this really was a secret way of communication. We do know that the friends to the slaves would often have secret rooms or places where the slaves would not be seen if people in search for runaways came to find them. This network of secret routes, helpers, and hideaways is known as the Underground Railroad. It wasn't underground and it wasn't a railroad, but it got its name because it helped move slaves from place to place secretly. The Underground Railroad was not just one single route to the north. It was many different routes that eventually led to a free state. It was most active during the 1850s and 1860s, but it got its name as early as 1830. The people who were involved with the Underground Railroad had to be very careful to not get caught. Have you ever tried to write or speak in a secret code or language so that other people couldn't understand you? Well, this is exactly what the people involved with the Underground Railroad did. Because it was such a great risk to be a supporter or traveler of the Underground Railroad, a secret code was developed that helped people communicate. Many of the code words had something to do with a real railroad. Some of the secret words they used were baggage, referring to the fugitive slaves carried by Underground Railroad workers, stations, meaning a place of safety or a safe house, and conductor, someone who directly transported slaves from place to place. Harriet Tubman was a well-known conductor on the Underground Railroad. She was born into slavery in 1820 in the state of Maryland. Harriet Tubman's life as a slave was very difficult. She worked hard, but was still beaten many times throughout her life.